The elevator clicked to a stop on the 7th floor. Bumpy Johnson adjusted his cufflinks, straightened his tie, and took one final breath. Behind that door sat 50 men who wanted him gone. Police commissioners, district attorneys, federal judges, city councilmen, mob bosses from 5 families, and Harlem's own power brokers who'd grown fat feeding off his absence during his 11 years in prison. November 3, 1963, the Chrysler Building boardroom. What was supposed to be Bumpy's execution had become something else entirely. The most dangerous chess match in New York's history. But nobody knew what Bumpy Johnson had been planning for the past 4 months since his release from Alcatraz. Not the FBI agents monitoring his every move. Not the Italian families who'd carved up his territory. Not even the men in that room who thought they were about to watch the funeral of Harlem's last king. They had no idea they were witnessing its resurrection. To understand what happened in that room, you need to understand what New York looked like in November 1963. This wasn't the romanticized Harlem of jazz clubs and speakeasies anymore. This was a neighborhood under occupation. The Genovese family controlled the numbers racket. The Bonanno family ran protection. The Lucchese family owned the loan sharking. The Colombo and Gambino families had divided the rest. And sitting over all of it, legitimizing it, were the politicians, judges, and police officials who'd grown rich looking the other way. They called it the Commission. 50 men who controlled every dollar that moved through Harlem. Every bet placed, every business opened, every deal made had to go through them. For 11 years while Bumpy rotted in federal prison, these men had convinced themselves they owned Harlem, that they'd finally tamed the untamable, that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was history, a relic of a time when one man could stand against an entire system. They were wrong. The meeting had been called by Commissioner Frank Hogan, Manhattan's district attorney. Officially it was a community safety briefing. Unofficially everyone knew what it really was. A trial, Bumpy Johnson's trial. The question wasn't whether he would be found guilty. The question was how they would divide the spoils after his conviction. But what none of these powerful men understood was that Bumpy had been watching them for 4 months, learning their routines, their weaknesses, their secrets. He discovered something that would change everything, something so dangerous, so explosive that it would shift the balance of power in New York forever. See, while these men had been celebrating Bumpy's absence, dividing his territory like vultures over a carcass, they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that 11 years in Alcatraz had broken him, isolated him, cut him off from the world. They had no idea that those 11 years had been the most productive of his life. Alcatraz wasn't just a prison for Bumpy Johnson. It was a university, a place where he'd studied power in its purest form, where he'd learned that the most dangerous criminals weren't the violent ones. They were the quiet ones. The ones who understood that information was more valuable than ammunition, that patience was more powerful than anger. In those gray cells, surrounded by murderers and bank robbers, Bumpy had developed something revolutionary, a network that extended beyond the walls of any prison, beyond the boundaries of any neighborhood, into the very heart of American institutions. He'd created what intelligence agencies would later call the most sophisticated information gathering operation in criminal history. But tonight in this boardroom, these 50 men still thought they were dealing with a street thug from Harlem. They had no comprehension that they were facing a strategic mastermind who'd spent 11 years preparing for this exact moment. The elevator doors opened. Bumpy Johnson stepped out. He was 68 years old now, grayer than when he'd gone to prison, thinner, but his eyes still carried that cold calculation that had made him a legend. He wore a charcoal gray suit, conservative tie, leather briefcase in his left hand. He looked like a businessman heading to a board meeting, which, in a way, he was. The conference room was massive, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, a mahogany table that could seat 60, and around that table, the 50 most powerful men in New York City, federal judges whispering with mob bosses, police commissioners sharing drinks with policy bank owners. The very corruption that Bumpy had spent his life fighting against, now legitimized, institutionalized, and sitting in one room. Commissioner Hogan stood at the head of the table. "Gentlemen, our guest has arrived." 50 pairs of eyes turned to watch Bumpy Johnson walk to the empty chair at the far end of the table, the chair they'd left for him, the defendant's chair, the condemned man's final seat. But Bumpy didn't sit down. He set his briefcase on the table and looked around the room slowly, making eye contact with each man. The silence stretched, tension filled the air like smoke. "Before we begin," Bumpy said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I want to thank you all for coming." A few nervous chuckles, They thought he was being sarcastic. He wasn't. You saved me considerable time and effort by gathering in one place. Makes what I have to show you much more efficient. Judge Morrison, a federal magistrate who'd taken money from the Genovese family for 8 years, shifted in his seat. Mr. Johnson, you're here to answer questions, not ask them. Bumpy opened his briefcase. Inside 50 manila envelopes, each labeled with a name. Each man's name in that room. Actually, Your Honor, I'm here to provide answers. Answers to questions you didn't know I was asking. The shift in the room was immediate. These men had expected defiance, maybe desperation, perhaps even violence. What they hadn't expected was this calm, methodical confidence. The tone of a man who wasn't fighting for his life, but conducting business. Commissioner Hogan leaned forward. Mr. Johnson, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of this meeting. Oh, there's been no misunderstanding, Commissioner. Bumpy's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. You called this meeting to formalize my elimination from Harlem's power structure. You've spent 4 months since my release coordinating with these gentlemen to ensure there's no place for me in the new order you've established. He gestured around the room. Federal judges to ensure harsh sentences. Police commissioners to guarantee arrests. Prosecutors to make sure charges stick. Mob bosses to control territory. Politicians to provide legal cover. A beautiful system, really. Comprehensive, elegant, profitable. Bumpy paused, letting his words sink in. Also completely dependent on one critical assumption, that Ellsworth Johnson was just another street criminal who could be overwhelmed by superior numbers and institutional power. He pulled out the first envelope. Judge Morrison's name written in neat block letters. That assumption, gentlemen, was incorrect. Judge Charles Morrison, federal magistrate, Southern District of New York, married to Margaret Morrison for 26 years, 2 children, both lawyers, outstanding reputation for integrity and fairness. Bumpy paused. Also took $47,000 from Vito Genovese between 1955 and 1962 in exchange for favorable sentences on racketeering charges. The room went dead silent. That's a lie, Morrison said, but his voice cracked.
Bumpy reached into the envelope and pulled out a photograph. Bank records. Deposit slips. December 15th, 1959. $5,000 deposited into your account at Chase Manhattan. Same day you sentenced Tony Bender to 3 years instead of 20 for extortion. Morrison's face had gone pale. Bumpy pulled out another envelope. Police Commissioner William Parker. Decorated veteran. 28 years on the force. Also owns a very nice vacation home in the Hamptons that costs $60,000. Interesting, considering your salary is $12,000 a year. Parker started to stand. You son of a Commissioner Parker. Bumpy's voice cut through the room like a blade. I'd be very careful about my next words if I were you. Because I have photographs of you accepting money from Carlo Gambino. I have recordings of you discussing police raid schedules with Frank Costello. And I have bank records showing deposits that match those meetings exactly. The power in the room was shifting. These men who'd come to destroy Bumpy Johnson were realizing they were the ones being destroyed. But nobody understood how this was possible. How had Bumpy, fresh out of federal prison, managed to gather intelligence on 50 of the most powerful men in New York? How had he penetrated their operations, their finances, their secret meeting? The answer was simple, and it would rewrite everything these men thought they knew about power. For 11 years in Alcatraz, Bumpy had done something no other prisoner had ever attempted. He'd recruited guards, not through bribes or threats, but through respect. He'd listened to their problems, helped their families, used his connections to solve their difficulties. When a guard's son needed a job, Bumpy made a phone call. When a guard's wife needed surgery they couldn't afford, Bumpy arranged payment. But that was just the beginning. Each guard who owed Bumpy a favor became a recruitment tool for the next level. Prison administrators, federal marshals, court clerks, FBI secretaries, people with access to files, wiretaps, investigations, people who could see the patterns, track the money, identify the connection. By 1960, Bumpy's network included 47 federal employees across 12 agencies. By 1962, it had grown to over 100 informants in positions ranging from bank tellers to federal judges' assistants. They didn't even know they were part of a network. They just knew that Bumpy Johnson had helped them once. And when he asked for a small favor, copying a file, remembering a conversation, noting a meeting, they felt obligated to help. The genius wasn't in the recruitment, it was in the coordination. Bumpy had created what intelligence professionals would later recognize as a distributed surveillance system. No single person knew enough to compromise the operation, but together, they provided comprehensive coverage of New York's power structure.
From his cell in Alcatraz, Bumpy had been watching these 50 men for years, learning their habits, documenting their weaknesses, cataloging their crimes. He knew that Judge Morrison had gambling debts, that Commissioner Parker was having an affair, that Prosecutor Williams had a son who needed a kidney transplant and couldn't afford the surgery. Information wasn't just power for Bumpy Johnson. Information was ammunition, and by November 1963, he had enough ammunition to level Manhattan. By the time he left Alcatraz, he had 43 federal prison guards who owed him favors. Guards who transferred to other prisons, other jobs, other agencies. Guards who became supervisors, wardens, federal marshals. Guards who had access to files, records, wiretaps, investigations. For 4 months, those men had been gathering intelligence, photographs, documents, recordings, bank records, every dirty deal, every corrupt transaction, every secret meeting these 50 men thought was private. Bumpy had been watching, listening, documenting, and now, sitting at this table, he held enough evidence to destroy every man in this room. District Attorney Hogan, Bumpy continued, pulling out another envelope. The man who called this meeting, the man who thinks he's going to put me back in prison. He opened the envelope, spread photographs across the table. These are pictures of you meeting with Vincent Gigante last month, discussing my case, discussing how much my conviction would be worth to certain interested parties. Hogan's mouth opened and closed like a fish. You see, gentlemen, Bumpy said, walking slowly around the table, you made a fundamental error. You assumed that because I was in prison, I was powerless. You assumed that because I was old, I was finished. You assumed that because you outnumbered me 50-1, you had already won. He stopped walking, faced the room. You forgot who you were dealing with. The next 20 minutes changed the course of New York politics forever. One by one, Bumpy opened envelopes. One by one, he laid out evidence that would destroy careers, end marriages, send men to federal prison. Bank records showing payoffs. Photographs showing secret meetings. Recordings of conversations these men thought were private. Judge Morrison had taken money from the mob. Commissioner Parker had sold police protection. City Councilman Roberts had fixed zoning permits for the families. Federal Prosecutor Williams had thrown cases in exchange for cash. On and on, envelope after envelope, until the table was covered with evidence of the most comprehensive corruption network in New York history. But Bumpy wasn't finished. Now, gentlemen, we come to the interesting part. What happens next? He walked back to his chair, still standing. You have 2 choices. The first choice is war. You can try to destroy this evidence, discredit me, have me killed. But understand, if anything happens to me, if I don't make a specific phone call every Tuesday at 3 p.m., copies of everything you've seen tonight will be delivered to the New York Times, the FBI's Internal Affairs Division, and the Justice Department's Organized Crime Task Force. Silence. Pure terrified silence. The second choice is business. We renegotiate the arrangements in Harlem. We establish new rules. Rules that benefit everyone, but rules that I control. Commissioner Hogan found his voice. What kind of rules? Bumpy sat down for the first time since entering the room. Harlem belongs to me. All of it. North of 110th Street is my territory. Period. You gentlemen can continue your operations. Continue making money, but you do it through me. I take 40% of gross revenues from all illegal operations. In exchange, I provide protection from federal investigation, early warning of police raids, and coordination between the families to avoid conflicts. 40%, Vincent Chen Gigante spoke for the first time. That's insane. What's insane, Bumpy replied calmly, is thinking you have a choice. He was right, they didn't. The evidence on that table could destroy 50 careers, send dozens of men to federal prison, unravel the most lucrative criminal enterprise in New York history. And Bumpy Johnson, the man they'd thought was finished, the man they'd gathered to bury, held all of it in his hands. Furthermore, Bumpy continued, any decisions affecting Harlem get my approval first. No new operations without my permission. No territorial disputes without my mediation. No violence in my neighborhood without my authorization. Judge Morrison finally spoke. And if we agree to these arrangements, then you continue being judges, commissioners, prosecutors, and businessmen. Your secrets stay secret. Your families stay safe. Your money keeps flowing. Bumpy paused, but you do it knowing that Harlem has a king again. The vote was unanimous. What happened next? Rewrote the rules not just for Harlem, but for organized crime in America. For the first time in history, one man controlled an entire criminal ecosystem, not through violence or intimidation, but through intelligence and strategic thinking.
Bumpy didn't just defeat his enemies that night. He converted them into assets. He turned his greatest threat into his most valuable resource. 50 men who'd come to destroy him left that room as his employees. But the transformation went deeper than simple business arrangements. What Bumpy had engineered was a fundamental shift in how power operated in New York. Before that night, the system was chaotic, violent, unpredictable. Different families fought for territory. Police officials played favorites based on whoever paid them most. Judges made decisions based on personal relationships and immediate bribes. After that night, everything was coordinated. Bumpy established what he called the Harlem Accords, a comprehensive framework that governed every aspect of illegal activity north of 110th Street. Territorial disputes were resolved through arbitration rather than warfare. Police protection was distributed fairly based on payment schedules, not personal favoritism. Judicial decisions followed consistent patterns that everyone understood and could plan around. The commission still existed, but now it reported to Bumpy Johnson. The Italian family still operated, but under his oversight. The police still took money, but they did it through his network. The judges still fixed cases, but they cleared it through his organization. More importantly, Bumpy had solved the fundamental problem that plagued all criminal enterprises: unpredictability. By controlling both sides of the law, the criminals and the officials who were supposed to stop them, he'd created something unprecedented in American history: a stable, predictable, profitable criminal ecosystem. Within 6 months, Bumpy's operation was generating more money than any criminal enterprise in New York history. Not because he was more violent than his predecessors, but because he was smarter. He'd eliminated competition by controlling the referees. He'd minimized risk by owning the police. He'd maximized profit by coordinating instead of fighting. The numbers were staggering. Under the fragmented system that existed before November 1963, Harlem's various illegal operations generated approximately $2.3 million annually. Under Bumpy's coordinated system, that figure jumped to $7.8 million. Everyone made more money because everyone stopped fighting each other. But the most important change wasn't financial, it was psychological. November 3, 1963, was the night Harlem learned that intelligence beats intimidation, that preparation defeats power, that one old man with the right information could walk into a room with 50 enemies and walk out as their boss. Bumpy Johnson had proven something that would echo through criminal organizations for decades. The most dangerous weapon isn't a gun, it's knowing your enemy's secret. The men who left that boardroom would never forget the lesson, neither would their successors. For the next decade until Bumpy's death in 1968, Harlem operated under rules written by one man who understood something most people never learn. Power isn't about who has the most guns, the most money, or the most friends. Power is about information, timing, and the will to use both when the moment is right. Bumpy Johnson walked into that room as an ex-convict with enemies everywhere. He walked out as the undisputed king of the most important neighborhood in America, and he did it without firing a single shot.